In the burning heart of Judea, a storm of rebellion erupted. Jerusalem, sacred, defiant, unyielding, rose against the might of Rome. Legions that once marched invincible were slaughtered in narrow streets, their banners torn to shreds beneath the fury of zealots. The empire, stretched thin across continents, now faced a flame it could not ignore. And from this fire emerged a clash destined to scar history forever. A siege so merciless, a fall so devastating, it would echo through the ages as both triumph and tragedy. Stay with us as we uncover the rise of Vespasian, the unbreakable will of Titus, and the desperate last stand of Jerusalem. Witness the blood, the fire, and the fate that forever bound Rome and Judea. Like, subscribe, and journey with us into history's darkest siege. The year was AD 66, and the land of Judea seethed with fury. For decades, Roman rule had pressed down upon the Jewish people, extracting taxes, enforcing foreign laws, and desecrating what they held sacred. Tensions that had long smoldered in silence now burst into open flame. It was no mere riot, no passing disturbance. It was a revolt, vast and merciless, aimed not at reform, but at total defiance of Rome itself. It began in Caesarea, where disputes over land and religion ignited violence between Greeks and Jews. Roman officials, arrogant and brutal, responded with contempt. Soldiers plundered the temple treasury, seizing funds that belonged to God. This act struck at the very heart of Jewish identity, and the people erupted. The cries spread from village to village, from Galilee to the hills of Judea. Rome must be cast out. Jerusalem, the holy city, rose as the epicenter of rebellion. The zealots, fierce and unyielding, seized control of its streets. They murdered Roman officials, toppled symbols of imperial power, and rallied the people under banners of liberation. When the garrison of Roman soldiers in the Antonia fortress resisted, the rebels swarmed and annihilated them. For the first time, the eagle standards of Rome, the icons of its legions, were thrown down and desecrated in Jerusalem. It was a humiliation that shook the empire. Rome, mistress of the known world, had seen cities defy her before. Yet rarely had an entire province risen with such coordinated rage, and rarely had Roman soldiers been slaughtered so completely. Across the empire, whispers grew. Could Rome truly hold its grip on so many peoples, so many nations, so many faiths? The rebellion only deepened its resolve. Fortresses across Judea fell one by one to Jewish hands. Masada, perched high upon its cliffs, was seized and fortified. At Beth Horon, a Roman legion marching to subdue the uprising was ambushed and destroyed. 6,000 trained soldiers, veterans of countless wars, were massacred by men who fought with a blend of desperation and religious zeal. Rome had not suffered such a calamity in decades. News traveled swiftly to Rome, crossing the sea with each trembling messenger. Senators, accustomed to reports of victories, heard instead of annihilation. Their empire, stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa, suddenly found itself bleeding in the east. To lose Judea was not only to lose territory, it was to lose face. Rome's prestige was built on the illusion of inevitability, the sense that resistance was futile. But in Judea, resistance had drawn blood, and Rome's invincibility was questioned. The Jews of Jerusalem rejoiced. They believed the God of Israel had delivered them. In the great temple, sacrifices were offered in gratitude, hymns of victory echoing across its courts. For a moment, the city felt untouchable, a beacon of divine triumph standing against the greatest empire the world had ever known. But triumph breeds arrogance, and arrogance would soon demand its price. The Romans, humiliated, would not forgive nor forget. To lose soldiers was one thing. To lose the aura of dominance was another. The Emperor Nero, already hated by many, understood that his rule could not afford weakness. The Eastern legions were summoned, and into this maelstrom stepped one of Rome's most seasoned commanders, Vespasian. He was not yet emperor, not yet the founder of a dynasty, but his name would soon be carved into the fate of Jerusalem. Yet before Vespasian could march, the Jews themselves sowed the seeds of their undoing. Within Jerusalem, factions warred for control. Zealots clashed with moderates, revolutionaries fought among themselves. While Rome prepared its armies, the city that had declared itself free began to devour itself in civil strife. Still, in that first moment of rebellion, the tragedy was not yet written. To the rebels, victory seemed possible. They had slain Roman soldiers, toppled Roman banners, and reclaimed their sacred city. To them, this was not madness, it was destiny. They saw themselves as heirs to the Maccabees, the warriors who had once driven out foreign oppressors. They believed God himself walked with them. But Rome was not a mere oppressor. Rome was the colossus of the world, an empire of stone and steel, legions and roads, emperors and gods. And when Rome was challenged, it answered not with mercy, but with fire. The tragedy of Jerusalem was already unfolding, and though its people could not yet see it, their holy city was already doomed. For in the distance, beyond the seas, beyond the deserts, the war drums of Rome were beginning to beat. And when Rome marched, cities burned. In the ashes of defeat, Rome searched for saviors. The legions in Judea had been broken, their banners trampled, their honor humiliated. The empire needed men who embodied more than brute strength. It needed leaders who could endure hardship, command loyalty, and crush rebellion with unshakable resolve. Out of this need rose two figures, father and son, whose fates would entwine with that of Jerusalem, Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian was no stranger to hardship. Born not of noble lineage, but of equestrian rank, he had risen through merit, sweat, and perseverance. He had fought in Britain under Claudius, marching through swamps and forests where lesser men faltered. He had governed provinces where corruption thrived, and unlike many, he had emerged not broken, but hardened. Practical, disciplined, and unpretentious, Vespasian was a soldier's general. His men trusted him, for he shared their burdens, ate their rations, and slept upon the same cold ground. To Rome, weary of aristocrats who led from luxury, he was the embodiment of the old virtues, stubborn, enduring, relentless. When Nero's court summoned him to the east, Vespasian did not come as a glittering noble, but as a commander forged in necessity. By his side marched the veterans of the legions, the 5th, the 10th, and the 15th. These were men who had fought in countless campaigns, scarred by battles against Parthians, Britons, and Germans. Behind them followed auxiliaries drawn from the far corners of the empire, archers from Syria, cavalry from Gaul, engineers from Alexandria. It was not just an army, it was the world itself, assembled beneath Rome's eagle. But Vespasian did not march alone. With him rode his eldest son, Titus, a man not yet 30, but already marked by destiny. Titus possessed what his father lacked, the charisma of command, the presence that could stir men's hearts. Handsome, eloquent, and cultured, he was Rome's answer to the fiery zeal that blazed in Jerusalem. Where Vespasian inspired through steadiness, Titus inspired through brilliance. Soldiers who followed him felt they were part of history in the making, swept along by his energy and vision. Together, father and son embodied a rare balance, discipline and daring, patience and audacity. Vespasian laid the foundations. Titus set them aflame. It was this union that would prove fatal to Jerusalem. When Vespasian landed in Judea in AD 67, he wasted no time. He understood that rebellion was not merely a battlefield to be won, but a disease to be excised. He advanced methodically, fortress by fortress, village by village, strangling the revolt piece by piece. The Galilee, stronghold of Jewish resistance, fell under his relentless pressure. At Jotapata, the defenders fought with desperate valor, yet Vespasian ground them down with siege towers, rams, and fire. The historian Josephus, once a commander of the rebels, was captured there, and from that moment, he would become a chronicler of Rome's vengeance. Titus proved his mettle beside his father. At Tarichaea, he led cavalry charges that scattered rebel formations. At Gamala, a mountain fortress clinging to the cliffs, he scaled impossible slopes under a hail of stones and arrows, driving his men forward when others would have faltered. Soldiers saw in him a commander who did not shrink from danger, but shared it, sword in hand, shield raised high. Tales of his courage spread through the legions, binding them to him with loyalty as fierce as any oath. As fortress after fortress fell, Jerusalem became increasingly isolated. The rebels inside grew desperate, turning their swords not only against Romans, but against one another. Yet for all their divisions, they prepared for the inevitable clash, for they knew Rome would not rest until the holy city was crushed. By AD 68, Vespasian had nearly completed the subjugation of Judea. Only Jerusalem remained. Then fate intervened. News arrived of chaos in Rome itself. Nero was dead. The empire, that eternal colossus, staggered into civil war. One emperor after another rose and fell, as legions across the provinces declared their generals rulers of the world. Vespasian halted his advance, for even he could not storm Jerusalem while Rome itself teetered. It was during this time of uncertainty that the bond between Vespasian and Titus grew unbreakable. Together they waited, consolidating their power, gathering resources, and watching as Rome devoured itself. And when the moment came, when the legions of the East declared for Vespasian, father and son seized their destiny. Vespasian was hailed emperor, carried not by senatorial decree but by the will of the army. Titus stood ready as heir, his role in Judea now magnified. The stage was set. The rebellion in Jerusalem had given birth to the Flavian dynasty. Rome had found its saviors, and their path to glory lay through fire and blood. For Titus, this was more than duty. He understood what Jerusalem symbolized. To the Jews, it was the dwelling place of their God, a city of eternal promise. To Rome, it was the heart of defiance, a wound to imperial pride that must be torn out root and branch. If he triumphed here, his name would be immortal. If he failed, he would be forever branded the commander who faltered before zealots. Thus father and son prepared for the final act. Vespasian, steady as stone, ensured the empire's foundations were secured. Titus, restless as flame, sharpened the sword that would descend upon Jerusalem. Together they rose, not as conquerors seeking plunder, but as the embodiment of Rome itself, unyielding, inexorable, eternal. And in Jerusalem, the defenders watched the horizon, knowing that Rome's storm was gathering. For in the rise of Vespasian and Titus lay the doom of their city. Rome prided itself on eternity. Its walls had stood for centuries. Its legions had marched to the ends of the earth. Its laws bound peoples from Britannia to Arabia. Yet beneath the marble and triumphal arches, cracks had begun to spread. Judea was aflame, but it was not the only fire. Rome itself quaked, not from foreign invasion but from the rot of its own ambition. The year AD 68 brought disaster, not on the battlefield, but in the palace. Nero, the emperor whose name had once commanded dread, found himself abandoned by allies, despised by the Senate, and forsaken by the legions. As rebellion tore Judea apart, the capital of the empire descended into chaos. Nero's suicide plunged Rome into what would be remembered as the Year of the Four Emperors, a maelstrom of civil war that revealed the empire's fragility more than any enemy could. Galba rose first, hailed by the legions of Spain. Yet his rule was brittle, for he lacked the favor of the Praetorian Guard, those soldiers who stood watch over Rome itself. Within months, Otho seized power, and Galba's head rolled upon the forum stones. But Otho, desperate and insecure, soon faced Vitellius, proclaimed emperor by the German legions. Rome's provinces, each armed and restless, now dictated the fate of emperors. The heart of the empire was no longer secure. It was hostage to the swords of its own armies. While Rome tore itself apart, Jerusalem watched. The Jewish rebels, though racked by their own factional strife, saw in Rome's turmoil a sign of divine favor. Could the empire truly suppress them while its throne passed from one pretender to another? Each Roman defeat on distant fields, each whisper of mutiny, breathed hope into the defenders of Judea. Perhaps Rome's grip was loosening. Perhaps the eternal empire was not eternal after all. The Senate, too, trembled. The cost of war in Judea mounted while revenues shrank. Grain fleets from Egypt faltered under threat of piracy. Taxes drained the provinces to fill the coffers of emperors who might not live the year. Senators debated not only the rebellion in the east, but the future of Rome itself. Should they continue to stretch their legions across the world or retreat to secure the core? Was the empire too vast, too fragile to endure? These doubts were heresy to Roman pride, yet they grew louder with each month of instability. It was in this chaos that Vespasian saw his chance. Unlike Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, he did not rush to claim the throne. He let them exhaust themselves, let Rome feel the full weight of disorder. And when the Eastern legions, men hardened by years of campaigning, declared their loyalty to him, the balance shifted. Egypt, the lifeblood of Rome's grain supply, pledged its ships to Vespasian. Syria and Judea gave their armies. The Flavian cause was born not from senatorial decree but from the raw steel of the provinces. Yet even as Vespasian secured his power, the empire's tremors were not silenced. Vitellius clung to Rome, his supporters rioting in the streets, his soldiers looting the city. Civil war ravaged Italy as Flavian and Vitellian legions clashed. Brothers fought brothers under different banners, Roman steel cutting Roman flesh. The empire had seen rebellion before, but rarely had it turned so savagely upon itself. The world watched in awe and dread. Could Rome, master of nations, survive the fury of its own children? For Judea, these divisions offered a fleeting illusion of hope. If Rome was devouring itself, perhaps Jerusalem could endure. But the truth was harsher. Civil war might slow the empire's hand, but it also hardened its will. The Flavians, rising from bloodshed, could not afford weakness. To secure their dynasty, to prove their legitimacy, they needed a victory so absolute it would silence doubt. That victory lay in Jerusalem. Within the empire, ordinary people bore the cost of these struggles. Farmers saw their harvests seized for armies. Merchants watched their caravans stripped bare to pay for wars. Families grieved sons, lost not to foreign battlefields but to Roman blades in civil strife. The myth of Rome as eternal guardian faltered, replaced by the grim reality of power seized by force and held through fear. Still, out of chaos, order slowly reemerged. Vespasian, pragmatic and unshaken, marched west to claim the throne. His generals carried his banners into Italy, overthrowing Vitellius in bloody street battles. The Senate, cowed and weary, accepted the inevitable. At last, the civil war ended, and Vespasian was hailed emperor. Rome had a new master, one born not of noble ancestry, but of soldier's grit. Yet for Vespasian, peace in Rome was only half the task. His legitimacy, fragile and contested, required a spectacle, a triumph that would proclaim to all the world that the gods themselves favored the Flavian house. And so his eyes turned once more to Judea, where his son Titus stood ready. The rebellion that had once humiliated Rome would become the crucible in which the Flavians forged their dynasty. Thus the empire, though shaken, did not fall. It trembled, it cracked, it bled, but it endured. And like a wounded beast, Rome lashed out with greater fury than before. The world would soon see that the empire, though vulnerable, was still capable of devastation. In Jerusalem, the rebels sharpened their blades and prayed to their God. In Rome, senators whispered of fate and dynasties. And across the empire, the people waited, wondering whether the storms of civil war had passed, or whether they were only the beginning. The empire had trembled, but now it was ready to roar. Jerusalem was no ordinary city. To the Jews, it was the beating heart of their faith, the place where heaven touched earth. The great temple, gleaming with gold, dominated the skyline, a monument not only to their God, but to their identity as a people. To lose Jerusalem was to lose themselves. And so when Rome advanced with its legions and engines of war, the defenders steeled their hearts. They were not merely men protecting walls of stone. They were guardians of a covenant, willing to embrace death before dishonor. The Jewish resistance was no single army. It was a tapestry of factions, bound together by faith but divided by ideology. The Zealots, fierce and uncompromising, sought to drive out Rome at any cost. They preached that surrender was betrayal, that death was glory, that to fall with a sword in hand was to rise in honor before God. Beside them stood the Sicarii, daggermen who struck from shadows, assassins who considered mercy weakness. Other groups, less extreme, sought compromise or defense. Yet in the crucible of Jerusalem, moderation was drowned by zeal. The defenders were not professional soldiers like the legions of Rome. drilled daily, armored in steel. They were craftsmen, priests, farmers, and scholars. Yet desperation forged them into warriors. Blacksmiths turned plows into spears. Stones from ruined buildings became missiles for slings. In the temple courts, boys learned to string bows, while women prepared pitch and oil to hurl upon the enemy. The entire city became an arsenal, every hand ready to fight, every street a potential battlefield. When Titus encircled Jerusalem, he did not face a city resigned to its fate. He faced a people who believed their struggle was righteous, sanctified. The words of prophets echoed in their ears, that God would deliver them as he had in ages past, when David slew giants and the Maccabees cast out oppressors. The rebels saw themselves not as doomed, but as chosen. To them, Rome was Goliath, and they were the hand of divine justice. Inside the city, however, unity was fragile. Faction fought faction even as Rome drew near. The Zealots seized control of the temple, slaughtering moderates who urged negotiation. Streets ran red not only with Roman blood, but with that of fellow Jews. In one infamous moment, the Zealots burned the city's food supplies to force resistance, believing hunger would stiffen resolve. Instead, it condemned thousands to starvation. Yet even in desperation, their fury did not waver. Better to perish as free men, they declared, than to live as slaves beneath the eagle of Rome. For Titus and his legions, these enemies were unlike any other. Gauls, Britons, and Parthians had fought fiercely, but they had eventually broken under Roman steel. The defenders of Jerusalem fought with a fanaticism that defied reason. When the Romans built siege ramps, the rebels tunneled beneath and set them aflame. When towers rose against the walls, men hurled themselves into the flames to drag them down. They fought from rooftops, from alleys, from the very stones of the temple itself. Every advance was paid for with Roman blood. The city's walls were formidable, built in layers that staggered the assault. The first wall surrounded the city's outskirts, the second wall guarded the heart of the districts, and the third, strongest of all, enclosed the temple and the upper city. Behind each line of defense, the rebels prepared ambushes. Every breach was not an ending, but the beginning of another nightmare. Rome, accustomed to swift victories, found itself entangled in a labyrinth of resistance. The suffering within the city reached apocalyptic levels. With supplies destroyed, famine devoured the population. Mothers watched their children wither. Families fought over scraps of bread. Disease stalked the crowded streets. Yet hunger did not break the defenders. It twisted them into even more desperate warriors. Tales spread of cannibalism, of neighbors turning on neighbors in madness. And still, the Zealots fought on, declaring that such suffering was the price of freedom. To the Romans outside, this enemy appeared both terrifying and incomprehensible. They faced not soldiers who valued life, but martyrs who welcomed death. When a Jewish fighter fell, another rose in his place, eyes blazing with conviction. Titus himself, though hardened by years of war, marveled at their resolve. He offered terms of surrender, urging the city to yield, promising mercy if they opened their gates. But the defenders answered with arrows and curses, spitting defiance from the ramparts. This was no ordinary siege. It was a holy war, where every stone of Jerusalem became a weapon, and every breath of its people was a vow never to bow. For the rebels, survival was secondary to meaning. If the city burned, if the temple fell, their blood would sanctify the cause and inspire generations yet unborn. In that defiance lay both their strength and their doom. For though their courage shook the Romans, it also hardened the empire's resolve. Titus realized that half measures would not suffice. To break Jerusalem, Rome must commit itself utterly. Every ramp, every wall, every soldier would be driven until the city was crushed beneath iron and fire. The defenders of Jerusalem had become more than enemies. They were symbols of resistance. They embodied the one thing Rome feared most, that its subjects might rise, not for conquest, not for wealth, but for belief. Against such conviction, legions and emperors alike seemed fragile, and so the stage was set. On one side, an empire that demanded obedience to preserve its majesty. On the other, a city that chose annihilation over submission. Between them lay destiny, written in blood. The city burned in silence beneath the Judean sun. Its walls still stood, its towers still bristled with defiance. But within, Jerusalem was dying. Starvation gnawed, civil strife devoured, and disease stalked the weak. Yet the city did not yield. From the ramparts, the defenders hurled their curses, their arrows, and their unbroken will. It was in this crucible that Titus, son of Vespasian, revealed not merely his valor, but his destiny. For Titus, Jerusalem was more than a city. It was the test of his command, the proof of his bloodline, the stage upon which he would step from his father's shadow into history. Vespasian had secured Rome's throne, but Titus would secure its legacy. The empire had trembled in civil war. Now it demanded a victory that would announce to the world that Rome still reigned supreme. That victory lay behind Jerusalem's gates. Titus began not with rash fury, but with cold calculation. He understood that brute force alone would not shatter this enemy. The walls were too strong, the defenders too determined. To hurl his legions in endless assaults was to bleed them white. Instead, he chose patience. Patience sharpened into cruelty. He ordered a complete encirclement of the city. Trenches were dug, ramparts raised, towers constructed. The legions sealed every road, every path, every gate. Jerusalem was cut off from the world, left to suffocate in its own desperation. Inside the city, the effects were immediate. With supplies already destroyed by the zealots, famine spread like wildfire. Grain was hoarded at sword point, water rationed by violence. The cries of hungry children echoed through the streets, haunting even the hardest warriors. Yet the defenders clung to their faith. Better to die with honor, they declared, than to kneel before Rome. Their bodies withered, but their defiance burned brighter. Titus pressed harder. He ordered the forests around Jerusalem stripped bare, their timber transformed into siege engines. Towers of wood loomed against the sky, bristling with catapults and ballistae. Battering rams hammered at the gates, while sappers dug beneath the walls. Day and night, the thunder of Roman labor echoed across the valley. The siege was not merely a military operation, it was a declaration of inevitability. The city was doomed, and every Roman hammer stroke drove that truth deeper into its soul. Yet Titus was not without cunning mercy. Time and again, he offered surrender. Messengers approached the walls, urging the defenders to yield, promising lives spared if they laid down arms. Some fled, slipping through sewers or scaling walls in the night. Many were captured, crucified before the gates as a warning to those who remained. But the zealots refused. To surrender was to betray God, to betray Jerusalem. They chose death, and in choosing death, they condemned the city. As weeks turned to months, Jerusalem became a graveyard. Corpses filled the streets, stacked in alleys, thrown from walls. Disease swept through the starving population, a plague more relentless than any legion. Still, the zealots fought. When Romans breached one wall, the rebels fell back to the next. When towers fell, they fought from rooftops and temples. They turned ruin into fortress, ashes into battleground. Titus, seeing their unbreakable resolve, abandoned hesitation. If Jerusalem would not surrender, it would be annihilated. He tightened the noose. His engineers devised new siege works, vast ramps of stone and earth rising like mountains against the city. Under relentless assault, the outer defenses crumbled. The first wall fell, then the second. Each time, the Romans poured in, only to face ambushes and counterattacks that turned narrow streets into rivers of blood. The cost was staggering, but Titus pressed on. What set him apart was not simply his determination, but his vision. He understood that Jerusalem was more than a rebel stronghold. It was a symbol. To destroy it utterly would break not just the bodies of its defenders, but the spirit of resistance across the empire. And so his strategy became not conquest, but demonstration. He would make of Jerusalem an example so terrifying that no province would ever again dare defy Rome. Still, Titus wrestled with the fate of the temple. He admired its grandeur, its shining stones, its towering columns. More than once, he ordered his men to preserve it, to claim it as a trophy for Rome. Yet battle has a will of its own. Flames leapt where orders faltered, torches thrown in fury, sparks carried on the wind. The Temple of Solomon, the heart of Jerusalem, ignited. Golden roofs melted, timbers cracked, and sacred chambers filled with fire. The Jews wailed, their holy place consumed before their eyes. Whether Titus intended its destruction or merely failed to prevent it, the result was the same. The soul of Jerusalem was shattered. The defenders, maddened with grief, fought with even greater fury, but their cause was lost. With the temple gone, the city's spirit faltered, and the Romans pressed inexorably forward. Titus now stood not as a general, but as executioner. He oversaw crucifixions by the thousands, lines of crosses stretching across the hills. Prisoners were slaughtered or sold into slavery, their lives traded like spoils. The siege that began with promises of mercy ended in a harvest of death. Yet for Rome, it was a harvest of legitimacy. The empire, shaken by civil war, had found rebirth in conquest. The young commander had proven himself. He had faced an enemy unlike any other, a city that chose annihilation over surrender, and he had triumphed. In Titus, Rome found not only a victor, but a symbol of renewal. His name was carried in songs of the legions, his deeds etched into the annals of empire. The siege had revealed his character, pragmatic, ruthless, yet unwilling to shrink from destiny. He did not conquer Jerusalem alone. Famine, division, and despair had been his allies. But it was his will, sharpened by necessity, that turned suffering into Rome's triumph. Thus Titus, the son of Vespasian, became more than a general. He became the herald of Rome's rebirth. The city that had humiliated the empire now lay in ruins, its ashes a warning to all. Rome had trembled, but through Titus it rose again, forged anew in fire and blood. The final act began beneath a sky thick with smoke. Jerusalem, once the jewel of Judea, had been reduced to a carcass of stone and flame. The temple, its golden crown melted, its sacred courts charred, stood only as blackened ruin. The cries of the starving had fallen silent. In their place rose the clash of Roman steel and the groans of the dying. The great city had endured siege, famine, and fire. Now it faced its reckoning. Through shattered gates the legions poured, their shields glinting in the dim light of smoldering embers. Streets that once rang with psalms now echoed with the tramp of hobnailed sandals. Resistance lingered in alleys, in courtyards, in the broken shells of homes. Zealots fought with knives snatched from corpses, with stones torn from rubble, with faith sharper than any blade. But Rome's advance was inexorable. Every skirmish ended the same, with defenders cut down, their bodies thrown atop the heaps already choking the city. Titus rode at the heart of the storm. To his men he was more than a general. He was destiny made flesh. His calm gaze swept over the ruin, unflinching. His orders came not in shouts of rage, but in commands of iron certainty. Advance, burn, break. His father had seized Rome's throne. Now Titus would crown that triumph with fire. Yet even in victory, shadows lingered. Titus had wished to preserve the temple, to claim it as a monument to Rome's power. But flames once kindled care not for the desires of kings or generals. They spread with unrestrained fury, devouring holy sanctuaries, leaping from column to column until the very heart of Jerusalem collapsed in a storm of sparks. What had stood for centuries as the dwelling place of a people's God was consumed in a single night. To the Jews it was catastrophe. To the Romans it was conquest beyond measure. Outside the burning city, the valley bore witness to Rome's vengeance. Thousands of crosses lined the horizon, each bearing a prisoner, their bodies writhing or already still. The air stank of blood and smoke, of flesh and ash. To passers-by, it was a forest of agony. To Titus, it was a message etched against the sky. Thus ends rebellion. The survivors fared little better. Chains clinked as lines of captives were driven from the gates, men sold into slavery, women and children scattered to distant provinces. Some were forced into the arenas of Rome, where their deaths became spectacle for cheering crowds. Jerusalem was not merely defeated, it was erased. And yet from this abyss of ruin, Rome itself rose renewed. The empire had trembled only years before, shaken by civil war and the chaos of competing emperors. Provinces had doubted, legions had faltered, enemies had tested the empire's borders. But the fall of Jerusalem silenced those doubts. It was a thunderclap across the world, a declaration that Rome's dominion was unbroken. The city that defied the greatest empire on earth had been obliterated. No rival, no province, no people could look upon the fate of Jerusalem and not feel the weight of Rome's will. In Rome, news of the victory was greeted with rapture. The Senate hailed Vespasian and Titus as saviors of the empire. Triumphs were prepared, arches raised, and coins struck to commemorate the conquest. When Titus returned, he did not come as the shadow of his father, but as a hero in his own right. His name, once uncertain, now rang with the authority of victory. The destruction of Jerusalem had written him into eternity, but for the Jews the echoes were of grief, not glory. Exiles wandered the empire, their homeland shattered, their temple gone. The dream of independence lay buried in the ruins of their holy city. What remained was memory, memory of fire and ruin, of a last stand fought with unyielding faith. Their tragedy was Rome's triumph, their loss, Rome's rebirth. The siege was over, but its legacy had only begun. It stood as a testament to the extremes of human will. On one side, a people who chose annihilation over surrender. On the other, an empire that forged its survival in ruthless conquest. Both sides bled, but only one emerged reborn. As Jerusalem's smoke drifted into the heavens, the empire inhaled the breath of revival. The chaos of civil war was forgotten in the blaze of victory. The legions, bloodied yet unbroken, marched back as living proof of Rome's eternal strength. And Titus, heir to both triumph and throne, carried with him the mantle of destiny. Thus the fall of Jerusalem was not merely the end of a city, it was the rebirth of an empire. From its ashes, Rome proclaimed to the world that it remained the master of nations, the unchallenged ruler of men. And though history would mourn the loss, Rome celebrated the resurrection of its power, etched forever in fire, steel, and the silence of a city that dared to defy.